Good evening, viewers from India and across the globe. My name is Zuchamo Yanthan, President of the Naga Scholars Association. Well, I, on behalf of the Naga Scholars Association, take this wonderful opportunity to welcome each and every one of you to our webinar special talk on the topic, Conversation on Self-Determination as Human Rights, which is a very relevant topic, especially in context of the Nagas today. You know, it is expected, and of course we hope that this special talk will enable us to have a clearer understanding on the topic, Conversation on Self-Determination as Human Rights. And I once again take this opportunity to welcome each and every one of you. Well, without wasting much time, I will directly go to the introduction of the speakers for today. Well, this evening we are extremely privileged to have Mr.Gam Shimray, who is Secretary General, Asian Indigenous Peoples Pact. He is based in Ching Mai in Thailand. Well, let me give a brief introduction about him. Well, Mr.Gam Shimray is a Naga, and he is a devoted human rights activist for almost 30 years. And he has held many important positions and was part of several civil and democratic rights initiatives. And as the current Secretary General of AIPP, that is Asian Indigenous Peoples Pact, he envisions to contribute to advancing the pursuit of indigenous people's rights and democratizing in Asia. He has good knowledge and takes keen interest on issues of biodiversity and self-determination. He was also involved in peace building initiatives in India and has authored several publications relating to human rights, environment, and ethnic issues. Thank you very much, Mr. Gam Shimray, for accepting our invitation, to deliver a special talk today. We welcome you once again. And well, today's chairperson is again none other than Prof.Lanusashi Longkumer, who is the head of Department of Geography in Nagaland University. Well, a brief introduction about our chairperson. Professor Lanu, we call him Lanu, his full name is Lanusashi. Professor Lanu is a professor of geography in Nagaland University. He has also worked with the community on environmental conversation and human rights issues. He has authored several books and published many research papers. Professor Lanu, we are very thankful to you for accepting our invitation to chair today's session. And well, rapporteur for today is Ms. Yanthan. She is an assistant professor in Center for Naga Tribal Language Studies, Nagaland University. And this evening, we have a technical support team, but from a team it is known as Edu Trainers. Well, we are very thankful to the technical support team, Edu Trainers, for your willingness to help us and coordinate with today's webinar. Let me give a little brief introduction about Edu Trainers. Well, Edu Trainer is an NGO which was set up in 2016, and their vision is for social empowerment through education, and their mission is to share authentic content that inform, aspires, and educate. And well, one of their main focus is to provide education to the socially disadvantaged communities like the refugees, the tribals, slum dwellers, and so forth. So thank you, Edu Trainers, for collaborating with the Naga Scholars Association, and we hope we will be able to work together even in the days to come. And we also would like to say thanks to the flyer designer, Rosal Humtsoi. So, well, without wasting any time, I would like to give the time to our chairperson for today's special talk, that is Professor Lanusashi. So I request you to kindly unmute your mic and please take your time. Thank you.
Thank you, Zuchamo. First of all, I would like to thank the Naga Scholars Association, NAC, for giving me the privilege to chair this session, a special talk on self-determination as human rights. It is a pleasure for me to be part of this program, to be with the Secretary General of Asian Indigenous Peoples Pact, AIPP. I also want to acknowledge the presence of all the participants here from different parts of the region. I look forward to getting many insights from the speaker as well as from the open discussion that follows. Well, in the contemporary discourse, topic like human rights and self-determination is not only an interest to policymakers as well as academicians, but the fact is it is a human subject which nobody can dismiss it, as it directly implies to ensure a dignity of life for everyone on earth. In the post-colonial discourse, self-determination is generally understood within the scope of human rights. Article 1 in both international covenants of civil and political rights, which we call it ICCPRP, and international covenants on economic, social, and cultural rights, ICERSR, clearly states all people have the right to self-determination. Over again, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which is popularly understood as UN Truth, very well complements the concept of inalienable birthright that is enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which are both linked very closely to the concept of self-determination. The Article 3 and 4 of the UN Treaty very explicitly talks about indigenous people's rights to self-determination. Today, translating all these rights and provisions that is enshrined in the international law as well as in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, to realize this in reality is a distant dream. I may be sounding quite pessimistic, but there seems to be a very undefinable problem in understanding the definition of rights, justice, self-determination, etc., which are often rooted in the colonial past. Not only that, there are many emerging issues. For example, like understanding the not only understanding the definition of those important concepts like rights and justice, but there are discourses of individual rights and community rights which are competing with different priorities and narratives. There is also an issue of self-determination and territorial integrity, and so on. Not to forget about the most important thing that is happening in our midst, the ponderous negotiation between the Naga leaders and the government of India. With the topic self-determination as human rights by the speaker, Mr.Gam Shimray, I'm sure we will all be definitely enlightened by the end of the session. So without further ado, I would like to request, and I would like to rather invite our speaker to have the time, which will be followed by the open discussion. So I now invite our speaker to take the floor. Yes, Mr. Gam.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Lanu. And also thank you very much to the Naga Scholars Association for inviting me to speak on this very important topic. I will not be speaking in terms of details of articles and interpretations of many of these articles, but rather it is to bring some of these constitutive elements of human rights and self-determination, and then to link this to the current Naga peace talks, because at the moment there has been a lot of discussion about the Naga constitution and the flag. And I do think that we must discuss as Nagas about international law and international discourses, because the world have changed, and therefore we are doing the right thing. Now let me straight away get to my presentation. My presentation will be an argument for. Number one is that recognizing that self-determination is a constitutive element of human dignity and include free choice of people. Number two is that understanding the right to self-determination as a universal human right. Number three is that understanding self-determination and individual human rights as mutually necessary. Number four is how should selfhood be understood and applied to determination and government for a coherent narrative on self-determination and self-government. The fifth aspect is the need for recasting sovereignty as embodied in the person in the Naga peace political talks. Let me start by stating a few points about the application of right to self-determination. As you know that it was legally partially enshrined in the UN Charter of 1945, this right to self-determination. And that is why the UN Charter Article 1.2 mentions this right to self-determination. But the problem at that time was that the self-determination was applied through what was known as the saltwater rule, meaning that self-determination applied only to the colonies separated from its mother country by ocean. And then after that, the Universal Declaration on Human Rights was drafted. But this UDHR did not explicitly, though implied, did not mention this right to self-determination. Now, following this declaration, of course, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and International Covenant on Economic and Social Cultural Rights was, as mentioned by Professor Lanu, was adopted. And this is other two conventions under which the right to self-determination is explicitly mentioned. But some controversies around this application, partly for many reasons, which I will come to that later, but because it did not explicitly mention in the UDHR the debate that human rights, universal human rights and self-determination are two separating was the argument from some quarters. But overwhelmingly expressed views were that all members of member states of the United Nations must follow international human rights standards, and that even states established through violent means should not be recognized. Therefore, vast majorities of the international community saw self-determination and human rights to be mutually necessary. But the debate continued. However, if you will notice that when the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples was adopted, and by including indigenous peoples and by according the right of self-determination to indigenous peoples through the adoption of this UN DRIP, expanded the scope of the application of the right to self-determination. The UN included people with distinct characteristics who are encapsulated within state system through different coercive means. So this point of distinct characteristics is very important, which I will come back to that later. Now, these distinct characteristics means social, cultural, and political norms that the mainstream society hardly understands and is not featured in the governing institutions of the state. For example, we talk about the uniqueness of Naga history. So this is not just about the historical chronology of the Naga struggle, but it is also about the uniqueness of the Naga traditional institutions, ways of governance, social practices, resource governance, relationship to land, etc. These are the uniqueness that we are referring to. So secondly, it makes the relationship between universal human rights and self-determination explicit by emphasizing both individual and collective rights. So it is only in this document, one of the documents where this issue of collective rights and individual rights are comprehensively mentioned. So the conception of selfhood in the UN DRIP is both individual and collective selfhood. And therefore, it casts self-determination and human rights as mutually necessary. Therefore, when we talk about self-determination in the context of UN DRIP, it cannot be devoid of the universal human rights. It means that self-determination must be grounded on the principles of universal human rights. So that is the point that the UN DRIPS comes to clarify in a very explicit manner. Now, I would like to share a few words on sovereignty because it is connected and related. Sovereignty was not well understood and perceived in the colonial and decolonization period, that's the 50s and 60s. It was perceived to be identified with the state that is self-justifying and approving, meaning that some kind of a superstructure and superpower which is above everything else was sort of the very rough notion of sovereignty at that time. And this is also one of the reasons that some confusion prevailed over the relationship between self-determination and human rights that I mentioned earlier. However, if you look at the Article 1 of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, which states all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They are endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood, captures where sovereignty is actually embedded. And this is the basis of my argument. Let me elaborate a bit here. Here, freeness and equality in dignity and rights is inherently linked to the reason and conscience of a person. And this forms the basis of personhood, that is the individual as the moral agent. And this is what is captured in the Article 1 of the UDHR in a legal language. So what this means is that it is by human nature that we can know what is morally right or wrong and take responsibility for our action, because we have the capacity to reason. And since we have the capacity to reason, we are autonomous beings and morally equal in dignity and rights. So this is the conception from where it comes from when we talk about equality in terms of dignity and rights. No? This means that individual as a right-bearing agency is also where sovereignty is embedded in a political sense. It is for this reason that sovereignty and autonomy, when attributed to the moral subject, that is the right-bearing agency, comes as synonyms in both philosophical discussion and political theory. However, in a political system, the notion of state sovereignty is associated with the capacity to legislate the moral law. But sovereignty of reason and moral law rests with the person as the source. So if we mix up these two things, that is where the idea of sovereignty, confusion over sovereignty emerges. You know? So it means that state is a system, and as a system, it has the sovereignty to legislate the moral law, but sovereignty is with the individual. And here, when I say moral law, it refers to ruling out arbitrariness and absolute power. Now, absolute power in the sense of godly absoluteness. So, for instance, in the Christian, we will say about God being omnipotent, omnipresence, and omniscience. So that absoluteness is not what we are discussing about in a political system and in this conception of human rights. Therefore, the conclusive understanding that we can draw from these are the 5 points that I would like, 4 points that I would like to draw from what I have presented so far is that when we talk of self-determination, accounting for universal human rights is a necessary condition. Second is that when we talk of self-determination, how the self and the conception of the collective selfhood are featured will determine the legitimacy and meaning of the political framework and space. Third is that in a philosophical and political sense, sovereignty is embedded in the individual and not in the state. Fourth is that moral law also means that human rights is inseparable from duties and responsibilities. Therefore, resting sovereignty on the individual comes with huge responsibilities over the right-bearing agent. What this means is that when you have rights, rights always comes with duties and responsibilities, and you cannot separate out this aspect. So when I claim that I have right, it also means that I must fulfill my duties and responsibilities. And without that, you have no moral right to claim your human right. That's basically my argument. So with these 4 conclusions that I draw, why are these relevant in the Indo-Naga political talks? This is where I would like to get into now. First, in my view, India is a failed state because it has serious misunderstandings over the 4 conclusions that I have drawn. Therefore, while referring to universal principles in the talks, for example, the framework agreement claims to be based on universal democratic principles, there can be serious misunderstanding and hurdles across the negotiating table. So for example, they have used the term two entities, sovereignty, and so on. How are these interpreted? Do we have the same yardstick and same understanding? Those are the questions. So for example, when one is talking about sovereignty lies with the people, it could be without accounting the voice and opinion of the sovereign individuals. So in this case, then we would be self-contradicting and we would be pushing ourselves back to the colonial days or in the 50s and 60s, where the understanding was that collective rights impinges or hinders or minimizes individual human rights. No, but that is not the case. The other point is that Indian state was built on the understanding of sovereignty of the 50s and 60s, where it sees the state with arbitrary powers, self-approving, and the superior and the supervisor of all important matters over the vast geographical areas. And this has never been revisited since the Nehruvian era. No, it has not been politically debated, and therefore there are so many inherent contradictions that has not been resolved. Further, Indian state exhibits serious contradictions because it is designed to fit into their culture of hierarchy and transported the caste practices into the structure and bureaucracy. Therefore, discussion on decentralization has always meant control and heavy supervision with arbitrary powers of the center of the state. It is for this reason that India is deeply buried in power struggle and prejudices in every offices. And the problem is that the discussion on autonomy, decentralization, or political negotiations that are currently going on is pervaded by talks about more and more power without realizing that the problem is deeper than that. Therefore, if we do not learn and check ourselves, we will be blindly reproducing the colonial structures and the structures of the Indian illiberal democracy, either with or without the Naga constitution and flag. No? So I would like to come now to the question of the flag and the constitution. So what should we be talking about when we are referring to the Naga constitution and flag? First, we must start by looking at the uniqueness of the characteristics of the Naga people, like what the UN DRIP projects, and see what we can take from our worldview and practices, what we have already lost and what we can still revivify. What can we apply from the world of knowledge that we are now exposed to, for example, on women's rights? What and how can we contribute in deepening democracy in India? So that has to be part of our conception and approach, because we are not simply demanding for our rights just because we look different and just because we have a different name. If we do that, then we will be self-contradicting ourselves. We would actually be even towing the line of racism. You know? So therefore, what we should be looking at is more at the substantive level, and that is to say, in a very brief term, deepening of democracy in India itself. You know? So that the negotiation move towards partnership rather than separation and conflict between the two negotiating parties. No? So these are the questions that we must be asking in order to design our government properly around the political space that will come out of the negotiations. Let me pick up some examples of these questions. So fundamentally, we all want a political order that is consensual in nature, because we are talking about a democratic system of governance that accounts the individual as the sovereign. You know? And this issue of, therefore, consent making and tradition of consent becomes very important. Consent making is crucially the most important aspect of human civilization, and it governs our life from daily activities to political decision making. So when I say daily activities means, even for example, if I want to share a house rent in Delhi with a friend, there must be a consent making process between my friend or even my relative, or even in marriage, or even how a neighborhood cooperates, or in the case of Nagas, the clan and the community and so on. And if this consent breaks down, what happens is marriage will break down, sharing of house rent will also not work, and so on. So by nature, this consent making is so inherent and important in our socialization process in terms of daily life and political life. So consent making is very important. And our ancestors were able to develop a culture of consensus decision making. And this speaks of how they understood and accorded human dignity to one another. So when I see here, accorded dignity to one another means that when I am seeking a consent to share a room or to work together or share certain things together, politically or otherwise, it means I am recognizing that sovereignty of that person, the freedom of that person. So by entering into some kind of a dialogue, consent process, and coming to an agreement means that we are exercising our freedom. And that is why consent making becomes so important and fundamental in our lives. No? It recognizes that the dignity of the individuals as sovereign persons. So that everyone has the power to negotiate, guided by the common good, as well as to influence it. This was not something that was achieved through following formal decision-making procedures alone in our tradition, but a series of informal social processes which seem to have been forgotten now. Therefore, the collective selfhood where we share our life and develops our common good, in which the individual is the key agent, crystallized as one of the best forms of governance in the world that we see today. It could be even comparing from the time of the Greek days when such topics were discussed. And we see this to be one of the strongest in our traditions. It is for this reason that in the past, members of a community would claim that their village has everything to them. This is how the self shapes the collective selfhood, and how the collective selfhood gives identity to the self in a mutual manner. No? The second point that I would like to pick on is why our village republic system worked in the past. One of the main reasons it worked was because our village life was founded on the concept of community land ownership. It was seen to be wrong for anyone to die of starvation and to be without a land to survive. Because if we do not have land, you have nothing to negotiate as a sovereign with your friends and neighbors. So this means that, for example, if you do not have a land, because I have a land, I can talk with my neighbors, I can talk with my community members and so on, in terms of when I go and cultivate, how to share the water from the river, how to build the canal, and how to also help another in the work that we do, and all these kind of activities. So through this kind of relationship, we develop social reciprocity that comes into practice and is institutionalized either formally or informally. You know? And it is this culture of sharing reciprocity and decision-making that propagates bonding, trust, and love, and defines the selfhood and common good in the community. Therefore, self-determination has no meaning unless we are capable of sharing, bonding, and making decisions together by recognizing that each one of us are sovereign in our own way, and then developing this identity of our collective selfhood. The third aspect that I would like to point out is our customary law. When I ask where law comes from, most people replies that it comes through legislation in a top-down sense. No? Because this is the common practice with most Asian governments. However, customary law is a moral law that has been constituted by the sovereign members of the community over time. It is therefore a bottom-up and is of the most rooted kind that represents human civilization from the ground. People from common law tradition knows that lawmaking is a bottom-up process and would have much more appreciation to this. There can be no robust, and as you know that there can be no robust law or policy that is legitimate if there is no sound process and space for a healthy public debate. This also goes for constitution making, because a constitution must be made by the constituents, that is the sovereign individuals, no? And reflects the image of the Naga nationhood. The fourth and the last one is that I would also like to touch upon briefly on this idea of social contract. At the start of the conception of modern democratic state system, a social contract is presupposed. Presupposed in the sense that it was not the formal signing, but in the sense of a tacit agreement among its citizens. But this sense of social contract was limited to the generations of the present, or the present generation of that time. No? However, for the Nagas and indigenous peoples in general, the idea of social contract is much more than the present. We include the past, present, and the future, that is including our ancestors and the future generations, because we see a duty to respect and honor our ancestors and show gratitude, and to preserve what is good of our traditions and our land and resources for the future generations. You know? And in the contemporary time, the contemporary time is also challenged for a vision of living in harmony with nature. And it is indigenous peoples who has the most encompassing vision of this. So why not put to use when we talk about our own constitution? These are things that we should be talking about when we dream of our own constitution and flag. After all, a constitution is what will capture our wisdom and weaknesses and reflect the collective selfhood of who we are. It is something that that should deeply provoke our minds and sentiments, because we are here looking for something deeply emotional and spiritual, something that is beyond ourselves. It is not about like when you think, you know, you have found the love of your life, someone who is beyond yourself, and you are ready to give everything to that person. But after a year, you regret that it is the biggest mistake that you have made in your life. No? What I mean is, there are moments when the song is sung and the flag is hoisted, your eyes waters because you are moved by a profound emotion that comes from deep within you, and you feel something beyond yourself, for which sometimes you are even ready to give your life. For example, we were not warrior society, so we did not have standing army, but our collective selfhood nurtured altruism in the community. And every adult male member was ready to defend the honor of the community with their life. No? So this is the kind of profound emotion that we are talking about. Therefore, to have a constitution is part of our dream, and it is the first opportunity that we have got after 70 years of struggle. But will it capture our dream is the question. So I will end there for now, Professor Lanu. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you. Thank you, Cam. I hope it's audible now.
Much better.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, for your very insightful discussions. Yeah, I think Cam has very lucidly mentioned about both the topic self-determination and human rights in a way articulating from United UN Declaration on Human Rights, where it states, Article 1 states, all human beings are born free and equal in dignity. I think this is the grounding for all the discussions. And not only that, Gam has also touched upon the saltwater role, looking at the problem of self-determination and human rights where we are today from the lens of colonial, rather from the colonial lens to the universal Declaration of Human Rights or UN Charter. And I totally agree that it's important while talking about personal and collective self-determination. There is a need to come down to the level where the need to recasting sovereignty as embedded in the persons, contextualizing into Naga as well as from indigenous people's scenario. I think I would like to invite questions and comments from the esteemed members, but while doing so, I request that all the members to respect the time and also rather we involve in a very progressive manner so that everybody has equal share of time. So with this, I now invite questions, or if you have any comments from the audience. Yes. Participants, if you have any questions, please put forward. Hello. Yes, any questions or comments?
Sir, there is one question from Ma'am Vibha Joshi on the chat.
Okay, please.
On the chat, yeah.
Yes, from Vibha Joshi to everyone. Very interesting and thought-provoking. So I would like to ask if there is a contradictions in terms of everyone is born free in the customary law, which might bind individual to certain families as their worker. Yes. Gab, can you make out that?
Yeah, okay. Of course, definitely that it would contradict, and therefore it may seemingly be seen as the collective sort of limiting the individual. But in the context of the Nagas, that I would like to say is that not that everything is well founded, but we do have a system in which consent making is seen as the primary foundation in building that collective selfhood. And that, in that sense, of course, I'm not trying to deviate, but let's say, for example, that the proposal that I'm putting forward is that as long as we are able to root ourselves and found ourselves by recognizing the sovereign individual, and then the collective selfhood is built on this idea of where we recognize the freedom and consent making as a process. And consent making as a process here is, in a way, is also of a synthesis process. So for example, me as a member of my community, I exist because of the community. So the community also gives me an identity, and I'm also a contributor and part of that collective selfhood. Now, how do we go about this process? Therefore, I'm suggesting that it is this consent-making process, which is a synthesis process to a large extent. So let me say, for example, that the master says that I am the master because he or she has lots of servants. But then the servant may say that, okay, the master is there because I am there. But if I am not there, then can the master claim that he or she is the master? No? So then the question comes, who is the master then, no, after all? because if the servant is not there, then there is no more master. So there is this form of dependence there. And then this is a synthesis process. And of course, we have also seen that master-servant relationship also may lead to that kind of a synthesis where we find that the master and the servant also becomes best of friends. And sometimes the master and the servant also even marries and begin to share everything, you know. But so that is just to explain that this is a synthesis process when we talk about this collective selfhood. And the basis of that, when we imagine a constitution and a way forward, whatever that is there as that is wrong or maybe diminishing or not fully recognized, let's say, for example, on the issue of women, there would be lots of issues. You know? If we take into account that as a universal principle and something that we must adhere to, and look at consent making as a process, recognizing that the individual is so sovereign, then that process of synthesis that leads to the collective selfhood would provide a much better way forward. And that is the kind of future envisioning and constitutional making that we should be look at is really where I'm placing my proposal, no? And the way that I look at. Otherwise, there would always be situation of where somebody is rights is diminished or not fully recognized, or somebody has more freedom or privileges and so on. And that is part of the human nature. No? But how do we get out of this and move forward? And what kind of constitution that we would like to see is this whole grounding on consent making, recognizing the freedom of those and the dignity of the person.
Yes, Vipar Joshi, is there any more further questions in relation to what you have just asked? I have one request to all the participants. If you have any questions, please do raise your hand so that it'll be unmuted.
Sir, there's another question by Ma'am Vipa Joshi in the chat box.
Yes, yes, I'm reading it out. There are different traditional political systems among the Naga communities. So how do we bring consent for a single form of governance? Is democracy the best?
Yes, I would, at the outset, would recognize that democracy is the best. But of course, I see the limitation and the question that is being raised, which is of very important in nature, actually more for the Nagas that we should be taking up. Because what I have mentioned as a community life and so on, or what our village republic that was founded on community land ownership and so on, is at a very small scale, and it does have its limitation. And therefore also of a lot of variance between communities in terms of customary law and practices and how those things are managed and governed. But at the underlying theme where we see that possibility that can provide us the framework for us to develop is about the fact that we have that system where it is based on community land ownership. And I think that already provides this sort of the foundational framework that we can work on. So for the question for the Nagas is that this is already fast disappearing. So should we be part of that fast disappearing, contributing to that fast disappearing, or should we be part of the reconstruction of that and enlarging that scope of what was practiced as something that is very organic and something that we have seen is one of the best mode of practices that we have seen. So it is a question about that the Naga should be discussing of how do we enlarge, or are we going to abandon that and contribute to the vanishing part of it and destroy whatever we still have or we still can reconstruct. That is the question. To me, I believe that if we have a serious discussion on how we want to go about, particularly when we talk about constitution, I do think that we have the cultural resources to be able to bring forth that kind of a framework that can bring about a larger framework where it addresses the Nagas as kind of a nation, Yes.
Yes. Can we hear from Namrion?
Okay, so okay. Am I audible?
Yes, very much.
Thank you so much for the profound presentation and the initiative. We've been pondering a lot on the feasibilities and possibilities of executing our social and political rights. How practical can this be in relation to the contextual realities? For instance, for many observers, the strategy of the government seems to be one-sided. In parallel to our engagement at various levels, what shall we expect out of the peace talk? What's your take on it, sir?
Yes, I think what will come out of the peace talk is a big question, because we know that we have not been able to participate as we would have wanted to, even though there is some form of participation. I think this is the biggest weakness. And this is the case not just on the Naga side, but I would also like to put it in the context of the Indian side. For example, there is no intellectual discussion on the Naga peace talk. So what has happened is that Nagas have remained ourselves within the box of this ruling government. So we have been jumping from one box into another box of the different ruling governments. So we have never moved outside the box. And by being boxed, it actually diminishes, in my opinion, much further the possibility of the outcome that can provide the kind of political space where we can be self-determining and when we can actually be talking about deepening democracy in India, for instance. But it is also important for us to recognize that, for example, the current BJP government, it is a deeply ideological-based government. To me, deeply ideological also means that in the terms of extreme dogma I'm talking about, it becomes predictable in terms of what they think, how they think, and how they would like this talk outcome to be. But the weaknesses, I believe, on our side, on our part, is that we have not really tried to understand the strategy and how they look at the issue, and therefore how we should try to break those barriers, and then how we can try to kind of enlarge the scope of that discussion. And I think one of the most important area that we have missed out is really the intellectuals in India to whom that we should be talking more. And BJP, for example, being a very deeply ideological organization, to me is far more predictable than any other political parties. But we have not tried to understand this aspect. So let me put it this way, that we will always argue that there is lack of political will, But to me, this is not the issue of lack of political will. BJP government has a lot of political will, but what shapes the political will and what is their agenda? It is very easy to read, being a kind of a very fundamentalist Hindutva kind of a political organization. So we have seen how they are concerned about security, how they're concerned about territorial integrity, how they're concerned about economic growth, and so on. And we have seen this, how they have handled the Jammu and Kashmir issue and how they are now responding to the issue of China, for instance. So it's actually quite easy to read where they're heading and what they want. So their political will is directed towards what their ideology is saying and what they want to achieve. So it is not a lack of political ideology, but their political ideology does not meet our vision, the way that we want to see the world, the way we want to deepen democracy in India. So it is a mismatch of this vision. And this lack of vision will keep us, drawing us deeper down into the kind of a black hole, the kind of a, and sink deeper into that. So how do we break this? It is not an issue of lack of political will, and I want to do away with this myth of political will, where it is cited in the UN and every discussion. But I think it is not political will. It is that just that the political will is different and it doesn't match in the way that we want to see. And it is of corruption. And it is of how they see the world. And this is the reason why I was opening up this topic about how India conceives sovereignty, you know? And that strong government is what people are applauding. There are many people applauding. Like, for example, I saw the news channel the other day, and all the survey shows that they are in praise of Modi government, how it is handling the Chinese issue, for instance. The majority of the survey will show that, even though it's not the entire India, for instance. You know? So it is that kind of a very strong authoritarian and controls and might kind of a mighty state that is where it is still rooted, and these are the problems. How do we break this? We have to enter into a discussion with the Indian intellectuals on these matters. Otherwise, it's very difficult to predict. All we can say is that we may get a little bit of what we want. That would be the most that we can get out of this negotiation. That's all I can say. If it continues like that, no. So we are narrowing our possibilities. We have to be looking at enlarging our possibilities, and that is our mistake, and that is something that we as Nagas, that is not being discussed.
Yes, so we have some more questions. So we move on to Tauna. Are you speaking? Or should I read out?
They have to unmute the mic.
Yes. Donna? Or I'll read out the question to save some time, okay? Community rights, as claimed, have a deep shared emotional and spiritual notion attached to it by its member. However, how can maintenance of customary laws amidst growing notion among members of indigenous communities who feel increasingly detached from their customary laws be maintained?
Yes, I think this question again is very important. It may sound like a very obvious question, and then we may not pay attention to it, but these are questions that we should be inquiring deeper into, so thank you for that question. And this scenario that is reflected in the question is what I call the kind of a very chaotic situation that we are in. And what contributes to this is the point that we should understand. If we think that all this worldview and knowledge that we are learning from the universities and globalization and so on are not taken with a proper perspective, it can shake us. And the modern education system itself is power. At the same time, it can also shaken us. If we just import everything from outside without, of course, giving attention to our own values and system, no? So this is actually a symptom and a manifestation of the chaotic situation that we are going through, simply because our learning are being transported from outside alone. And we must understand that culture, there are negative elements in every culture, but we also must understand that culture is the supporting structure that makes us stable, on which we stand. And once this culture and our institutions are shaken, of course, it becomes chaotic, because we almost become like a collapsing society then. You know? And this is what we are seeing today. So the importance of culture and the structure on which we stand on are often neglected. So when the carpet is pulled under your feet, naturally we will fall down. And this is what is happening today, you know. But we must remember that this thing is happening also because of the years and decades of militarization that we have gone through. For like more than 100 years now, we have been under siege. We have not had the time to live our own life. It has been sort of manipulated and distorted by all kinds of learnings and also superimposition of structures and designs that when we have come into contact with the outside world, you know? So our coming into contact with the outside world is not in a proper way, it's not in a harmonious way or in a good sense. And that conflict and contradiction is what is giving rise to our situation now. So the question that our generation therefore must think is that, can we continue to survive this way? Or do we see that culture is important because it is the structure on which we stand? And can we rise to ourselves with confidence if we abandon our culture and the structure on which we stand? You know? So for instance, I know that I myself studied in Delhi. My generation, lots of the research work that we did was nothing really original in nature, you know? And we were struggling to make our connection with our real world, with our reality. So for instance, if I ask, what do you understand by customary law? There is hardly any an answer. We use the Mithun head as a political symbol, for example. In some Naga context, in some tribe, it is a buffalo head. And therefore, we know that the Mithun head is a political symbol. But what does that Mithun head represent? Nobody knows. And these are educated Naga lawyers who are helping to draft constitutions of our traditional institutions. So what are we going to make out of that kind of constitution that is drafted by our younger generation, for instance? No? So it is that kind of a very transporting of outside structures. That's what I mean to say that if we are not critical, we don't check ourselves, then we would be blindly reproducing that colonial structure and the kind of inherent contradiction of the Indian political system itself, even if we attain or have Naga constitution. You know? So the quality aspect of it is what we must discuss. And these are symptoms that we are going through. And then we must think about the future, you know, of what kind of society we want to be. And that should be a challenge to our present generation. Thank you.
Yes, Lupi, Terry, you have some question? Please unmute and you can ask. Terry? Okay, let me just read out then. How must we understand the self? And to what extent must one go to identify the self, negotiating the space of collective self for an ideology like self-determination?
I think that first is the fundamental aspect of what both Professor Lanu have said about the Article 1, what we make of it, and where does that come from, the principles, the values of. So if we recognize, and as a society we recognize that sovereignty lies with the individual, then the way that we will begin to frame our life would change in a very big way, I think. Rather than looking at the state as the sovereign, because state is just a system. So what we create the system is to undertake certain form of duties and responsibilities. No? So it is really in the self, I think, for me, in my opinion. Now, because Nagas are more than 98% Christian, let me just put it in the Christian way so that maybe it helps to understand, because we know that every worldview, religion contributed to this making itself. No? So for instance, when we say that the word. In the Bible, when the word that it is used in the Genesis, the word is referring to consciousness. And then it says that men are made in the image of God. That means God in some sense is referred to in the biblical sense is some kind of consciousness. And it is this consciousness that is endowed on every being, a part of it, no? And therefore, Christians' argument would be that there is a spark of divinity in every individual. And that makes it divine in some sense when we talk about identity. And that divineness in every religion itself is something that we cannot violate, and that is sovereign. No? And sovereignty therefore can be lodged only in the individual. It's not the system. No? And that has to be, I think, at the first instance, clear. And therefore, the individuals as the sovereign, as I mentioned, that's where we have seen that consent-making process must become the basis where we negotiate this collective selfhood or the identity of the self within that collective selfhood. No? And so I can only describe this in terms of the principles and the mechanisms of what we have been using within our community as the consent making. No? And I think it is a process that will never end, no? Because this is not exhaustive in the way that we build. So it will be a process that we will continue to build. And when I say that what we have seen within our community is also one of the best system of governance, is because I do feel that whatever its limitation is, the culture of consensus making in daily life, whether it's a neighborhood, in the family, clan, or community level, was quite well developed. And that is where the negotiation between the self and the collective selfhood manifests itself in that form of what we have seen. You know? And that can continue. And I think if we put our faith in this and trust in this, I think that synthesis is a lifelong process where we can flourish more in terms of addressing our individual needs as individual identity, and also how the collective identity will flourish, no, as being sort of a synthesis process.
Yes, there's a question. Sorry, I cannot get the name properly. So let me just read out. Collective selfhood is an idea foreign to many non-Indigenous ministers and MLAs, and the current bureaucratic systems are quite antithesis to this. Would you agree? Where could Naga correlate or draw from elsewhere in Asia or elsewhere?
I think it is a political challenge, and one of the challenges, as I say, we face is because we have lost this tradition to a large extent. And that is why in my own community, it's almost you feel like nobody listens to me, or the other person also feels nobody listens to the other person. You know, this is something that cannot happen in a very automatic sense, and therefore, what I'm saying that what should we bring back? What should we revivify? I would say that this is one part of it, but in terms of learning from others, you know, definitely I think we can learn a lot from others as well, because that is what our generation is about. So it's not limited within our own communities, and there are so many sources that we can learn from. For example, in Latin America itself, autonomy, self-determination is being opened up and discussed in various forms, and therefore, in the context of the global challenges itself, let's say, for example, on the issue of environment and ecological crisis, which I also mentioned, is that indigenous people seem to have, for example, the best view, kind of a vision of how do we live in harmony with nature. Because that is also the aspect of kind of synthesis, when we talk about relationship and how the collective sees this aspect. So we are in desperate need of a new vision, globally speaking, as well. So indigenous peoples all across the globe are beginning to discuss this and kind of bringing back the past, rooting themselves to the past, and also bringing in new things and learning from each other. So one of the crucial issues in Latin America, for instance, is the status of women and how do we include, or how they would include women as equal subjects in the final decision making body, for instance. So there are a lot to learn from on different subject matters. So for instance, I know at one point of time, Naga Hohoha, for instance, had taken this position that based on our customary law, Naga women cannot be represented in our traditional decision-making body. It is a self-contradiction, in my opinion, if we take into account and follow this kind of universal human rights principles. And these are the questions that we must deeply address if we are seeking universal human right as a redressal for the injustice done to us by other powers. Then we must also conform to the universal human rights, internally speaking, for instance. So there are a lot to learn, for example, on the issue of women's rights in their participation in decision-making and how they should participate. And these kind of discussions, even though people may not have a perfect model, but are experimenting. And I think that engaging in a serious way can take us a long way, even though we have not seen the daylight yet, but at least charting a path would lead us certainly towards embracing these universal human rights in a more deeper way.
Can we move on to next? Ruth Pash, would you like to unmute and speak? Let me just read it out. Here is a question. Why should Naga tribe of Manipur be called Ban Naga? Isn't Nagalim / Greater Nagaland for all the Nagas?
Well, I think that is why the importance of the Constitution. We don't yet know how we will call ourselves, how we will refer to ourselves. What is the best relationship that we can establish? How we can best come together that we truly recognize within ourselves, among ourselves as equals, whether one is in Arunachal or in Assam or Myanmar or in Manipur, for example. These are things that we have not debated. I give you an opinion now, of course, it will be it is subject to be disputed, and rightly so. But we need that kind of a platform that we should be able to debate on these matters, and therefore our Constitution should reflect this. And that is what I mean to say, that the Constitution will have to reflect that collective selfhood image of the Naga people. And that is how we know the yardstick, instead of shouting or criticizing from a distance where we have no possibility to synthesize our views and develop a common understanding and put into some form of a structure, and finally in the form of a constitution. And that's why the constitution is so critical, is of such a critical importance. That would be what I can say for now.
Yes, there's one more question. Chen, can you unmute and speak? It'll be good to see you. Yeah? Okay, I just read out the question 10. In the foreseeable future, completely new approach in the struggle of self-determination and human rights movement is likely to come into being. How is it going to affect the status quo, particularly the Naga issue and its people, with reference to the Naga issue and the people?
Yes, I think it will be a good thing if that truly happens. And of course, we should strive for it, that there is a greater, more vibrant movement based on human rights, understanding the substance of it, including this aspect of responsibilities. Because to be a human rights activist means you have to carry with you that sense of duties and responsibilities. And that is also why we say the individuals are sovereign. Now, how it will affect the Nagas, we have to therefore keep in mind and enlarge our scope of thinking. And that's why I keep referring to the importance of engaging with the mainstream Indian society as well. China is going to affect us. Myanmar is going to affect us. Bangladesh, Pakistan, all these are definitely going to affect us. And how it affects us will really depend on these big powers, how they're also going to play out. Whether they will continue to believe in the exercise of power and technology, military power, and so on. But we know that how far will technology move. And technology is advancing so much that even though we have Himalayas that is separating India and China, through the push of a button, we can destroy each other. The future may be that we have laser guns from the space shooting down, for example. So there is no security in all this way that we see. And that is also why it is so important to look at this approach of where we are looking at a more transformative pathways. And that's why I'm saying we have to look at India as a partnership, and not as separation and confrontation. Otherwise, we also become racist, and similarly for India as well. So how it will affect and how India changes, and therefore deepening democracy in India would also help the Nagas. It also help the neighboring countries. And that is why our vision must be far more far-sighted and not limited to just a demand for the right of the Nagas, where we pitch ourselves only on the aspect of the historical struggle and uniqueness. No, that is the point. So India, of course, we know that it cannot continue like this because it's full of contradiction. Modi government wants to homogenize through this Hindutva ideology. But very few today Indian intellectuals are discussing how is this possible. And Modi government may not realize that it is kind of impossible for them, because India is such a linguistic diversity. More than 18 languages, I think 18 languages are, for example, recognized in the Indian constitution. So of this kind of such diverse nature, how can you think about homogenizing and rolling out your power and social engineering and homogenize the whole country? It is a very, very challenging question we have not seen anywhere in the world. unless India is that kind of a miraculous power that will emerge. No, it is not a country where you have 2 or 3 diversity. It's 18 is already recognized, and there are many more that are not recognized. So how can this kind of things happen? So internal contradiction is bound to occur more and more. But when this happens, we should be ready to look at how do we deepen democracy in India? And that is also in our favor. And that is how it impact on the Nagas as well. How whatever little we're able to negotiate today can be positively impacted in the future if we keep a long-term vision of ourselves. You know? So that is would be my response here.
Yes, there's some more questions. Let me just read out. Community ownership of land and natural resources is disappearing, especially in the urban tribal setting in Naga areas in Manipur. How do we challenge this influence of state laws extensions such as MLR and LR Act 1960 of Manipur and Naga areas?
I think we have possibly like 2 options. One is to use the political institution as it exists in India, but the scope is very limited. So therefore, we may opt for political means, and that is the community assertion. And because land are still largely under our control, how do we checkmate the adverse forces that is coming in terms of business partnership through our own people and through our own political leaders? So it is that only that kind of community awareness, community mobilization, and community taking a stand by keeping this long-term vision and this aspect of our long-term survival that we can checkmate, I think, and that is political in nature. And something that we must also discuss in our constitution. In fact, if we have been going about the constitutional process and discussion, it could have opened up the scope to really deliberate and deepen our understanding of how we manage and control our resources. You know? Why I say on the other hand that using the state institutions is very limited is because one of the reasons I say that the institutional design in India is full of contradiction is precisely one of this. And we find it so difficult to use. So for example, in a concrete sense here is that, for example, land is a state matter, right? But mineral resources is a central subject, in the union list. And now in the Supreme Court judgment of 1996, it already even takes away the forest that grows on the land, you know? So you have this kind of very funny, artificial, unnatural kind of separation of land belongs to somebody, but the forest does not belong to you. And therefore, even the wild animals or diversity, etc., does not belong to you. It belongs to the central government, right? So this kind of full of contradiction. So are we going to raise this with our state government? The state government will say, okay, forest is not our subject matter, it's the central government. We have to go there. When is land issue, of course, we can go to the state. And then if the state doesn't agree, we go to the center, and the center will say this is a subject matter, and then all this kind of center-state relation will go on and round in kind of a circle, no? So these are the kind of contradictions that we see in terms of institutional design in the architect of the Indian Constitution. And these are very serious matters that we must understand, so that if we discuss and if we are also a force or at least an agent that can shed some light to some of these contradictions, maybe our discussion on the Constitution, maybe our discussion on the outcome of the political talks can also shed some light and give confidence to the other states in India and the people in India to relook at their constitution, their federalism, and so on, of this kind of contradiction that exists. And that is what I mean to say, that we must have a vision of also talking about some form of deepening democracy in India, because we cannot separate. By nature, we are already bound together in terms of geographical space. That is the thing. Thank you.
Yes, once again, I would like to remind all the esteemed participants that it will be good to see each other and then interact. So kindly, you can raise your hand or you click against your name just on the right side and unmute yourself, and we can see you. So yeah, next is, there's a question. Where is our identity when ceasefire is confined only to the state of Nagaland?
Can you repeat that for me, Professor Lanu?
Yes. Where is our identity when ceasefire is confined only to the state of Nagaland?
Well, I think this is, of course, important and a burning issue, but also a tricky one to kind of give a very succinct response to that. I think in the first place, ceasefire in the back of the mind of government of India. They know that it is totally irrational if it is confined to the state of Nagaland. But they go by the line of pleasing opposition from the neighbors, right? And this is the politics of neighborhood. And to some extent, the opposition from the neighbors is also a political knowledge that some of the leaders of the Indian government must be taking a mileage out of it. So these are sort of a very complex mixed kind of thing we can only guess. So, but we know that by any common sense, it cannot operate just in the state of Nagaland. And by, if you remember in the 2000s, when it was mentioned that ceasefire is without territorial limits, and Swaraj, and then of course the neighboring communities came up to oppose as what they call it uprising, and therefore government of India had to take back its own word for that kind of consideration of the kind of opposition that came. So therefore, if we take into account the logic of the Indian state, they also know by common sense that ceasefire is not limited to Nagaland and it has to operate everywhere. That's why Swaraj Kaushal was the person at that time as the interlocutor. That's why he said that how can there be a limit to the territory, because we have to meet everywhere. So for example, he even said, it extends even to Paris and London, wherever we meet. So we may meet in Delhi. So does it mean that if it is only in Nagaland, does it mean that they meet in Delhi and they will fight there? Or they have some kind of a right to fight there because it is limited to Nagaland? No? So this question of limiting to Nagaland, I think it is absolutely irrational and just speaks of the profoundness of stupidity that one can think of. But it is the politics of our neighbors. I think that is what I feel. What is important, I think, that we should be therefore looking at is how do we communicate with our neighbors? And I think that is very important. And what our neighbors also must understand is that here we are looking at something that is transformative. So if Nagas is able to give something to the neighbors, it's only when we have something, no? But if we don't have anything, we also cannot give anything to the neighbors. And therefore, if we look at this from this logic and building partnership and a larger vision. That is where I think we have to state our own facts and how to do with our facts, because facts knows no emotion. We should be prepared to hear the facts of the neighbors. The neighbors should be prepared to hear the facts of the Nagas. And let's table the facts and discuss. And what will be this yardstick? For us, it is the universal principle, because if the neighbor insists that it will be on the yardstick, Nagas will not accept. And if Nagas will insist that it will be on the yardstick of the Nagas, the neighbors will not accept. We will be mutually suspicious because we are part of the conflict. So let us use that international yardstick, as that has been well established now, and determine what to do with the facts that we have. And let's table it, and that is the way to go forward. Otherwise, these politics of where we are belittling ourselves and in fact give advantage to the adversary powers to whom we claim that all of us are collectively fighting. But when it comes down to our own issue, we are divided to the smallest fragment possible. No, this is the reality. So how do we get out of it is something that we have to seriously think, and we must communicate with the neighbors. Thank you.
Yes, Ro, would you like to unmute and speak?
Maybe last question.
Ro, Ro, would you like to unmute yourself and speak? It's a long question you have. Okay, let me read out 10. In the absence of nothing to be learned from the academic syllabus of present universities and colleges about ourselves, Nagas, then how can we deepen the understanding of ourselves individually and collectively in such situation? To worsen this, the culture of storytelling time in many Naga families have been replaced with the time occupied with modern gadgets and internet. Therefore, this is seriously affecting the Nagas to themselves deep to they adopt and adapt to others' ways and discarding their ways of life. What solution is forthcoming in this?
I think that yes, in terms of how our stories have been replaced. Recently, I was, for example, looking at one of the story, and I was deeply reflecting on it and what message does it carry. And I've seen that it has different interpretations today. But I found that some of the stories were really deeply meaningful and even can be useful at this kind of very difficult times in terms of what our ancestors tells us when we are pushed to the corner and we seem to be at the end of our strength because of the suffering that we are going through. No? But let me not tell you that story, but it is just to say that there are a lot to learn. And it is only by, I think, deeply reflecting that this is the necessity. And if we think that this is needed, as we say that necessity is the mother of invention, I think that if we see the necessity, we would be reinventing and we will also be rediscovering a lot of who we were and what our ancestral wisdom also tells us about many of the things that we want to learn from. No? But I would also say that academics, university, etc., is not an institution devoid of knowledge. We have a lot to learn from. But what do we learn? I think that is the question. And how do we learn? No? Now, let me just pose this for you, is that, for example, in the Western sense, they used to say the golden rule is treat others as you would like to be treated yourself. No? And the philosopher Jung was saying that this is a call to reciprocity. So it is a call to reciprocity, meaning that how you would, if you would like others to treat you, that means you must first know how you would like to be treated by others. So if you must know how you would like to be treated, it means that first is that you must know yourself. And there is this Greek axiom which says know thyself. No, that is the beginning of knowledge. It means that we must come to know our ignorance by humbling ourselves. So it is a radical call to humility, and by that response to that humility, we would also be able to begin to discover ourselves of the ignorance that we have. No, otherwise, then we will never know how I would like to be treated and how I should learn from others as well. So when I go to the university, unless I am clear about myself, who I am, know thyself, as it says, you know, our learnings becomes shallow and superficial, and it can also corrupt our identity. And I think this is one of the phenomenon or a factor that we see today. So, but if we see this necessity, and if we know ourselves, and we see the need of this, I think we can reinvent ourselves in many forms. And there are so many tools today, so it could be used to our advantage, or it could be used to destroy ourselves. Precisely, it's a double-edged sword. No? And it is only by knowing ourselves. So I still believe that Greek axiom of know thyself, and that is the beginning. No? So that's what I can say.
Vepachosh, would you like to come in? Unmute yourself and speak. Yes.
Hi.
Okay.
Yeah, it's very, very interesting talk and very interesting question and answer. I just wanted to clarify one thing. Mr. Shimray has been talking about constitution, and I was just wondering whether he's referring to the Yazabo as it is known, and earlier, and is it being account the new developments and aspirations of people, especially, I mean, I'm now talking about Nagaland because I'm more familiar with what's happening there, and which is about women's aspirations for equal political rights and inheritance law, and whether that would also constitute in the constitution of a sovereign nation that you're talking about. Thank you. I'll mute myself now.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Gam?
Dr. Lanu, did you hear the whole question? The earlier part was missed, so I couldn't fully understand the context of the last part that I heard.
Okay, let me just read out what she had written. So do I understand correctly that the constitution you are referring to is the Izabo, which was revised some years ago? So it is being revised again to take into account new developments and aspirations. Within bracket, for example, women aspiration to equal political rights.
Okay. Yeah, thank you for asking that question. First is that I'm not referring to the Yazabo when I'm talking about constitution as such, because Yazabo is a constitution, I think, is something that has not been debated, and is in fact something that I have hardly looked at. I had a look at the older version than the revised one that you're actually mentioning. So, but to my mind is also that the NSN itself, I believe, is looking at beyond the Yazabo when they're talking about the constitution. That's would be my assumption, in which I may be wrong. So as far as this political right of women in relation to land or other kinds of rights, yes, in my call for the constitution that we must be debating and formulating, I think those would be one of the critical aspects that we have to address so that we are at par with or in league with at least accounting for the universal human rights, no? And where we say that everyone is equal and it does not distinguish men or women there. So I was talking of this constitution more as something that should be more engaging and something that should be more reflective through the deliberation of individuals, in which case I'm referring to that the constitution at the first start of it should recognize that individuals are sovereign, and therefore constitution should be something that represents a kind of a synthesis of these process, no, that gives the image of the Naga nationhood. That's what I was referring to more.
Okay. You want to further clarify, Vepa?
No, that's fine. That's what I was wondering, and thank you for your reply. It clears my understanding of what you were talking about. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, thank you. Then we move on to next. What were the problem? Why Indo-Nagas issue keep unsolved? Was it for the lack of human resource or the ideological approaches, internal breakdown or external forces? Do you recommend any new movements or ideologies to strengthen our issue?
Okay, I missed one word, but maybe I understood it correctly, so let me just give it a try. Or
Should I?
Oh, because your voice is breaking a little bit in between, Professor Lanu.
What were the problems? Why Indo-Nagas issue keep unresolved? Was it for the lack of human resource or the ideological approaches, internal breakdown or external forces? Do you recommend any new movements or ideologies to strengthen our issue?
Yeah, in terms of the problems to the Naga movement, I think it is a combination of all the factors actually mentioned in the question itself. But in terms of strengthening ourselves, I think as the world has changed and we have lots and lots of new generations now interacting with the world, the discussion on what we want to be and how we should move forward and how do we interact with the other societies in a much more informed way, I think is the way forward, in which means that our civil society must become much more vibrant, you know. But just a point of 1 or 2 points in terms of the problems and where we seem to be going through a roller coaster, or sometimes we are sort of falling short of the expectations from our movement leaders and so on, would be just one is that if we see the beginning of the Naga movement, the community rose in protest. So these communities were not people who can use modern armed weaponaries or can use modern technology in terms of communication or even right, but the communities just rose in arms in response to the aggression by the Indian military at that time. And therefore, in the 50s, a lot of the Naga people were almost already broken before the 60s, and therefore we were all in concentration camps and starvation deaths and so on, and that's how the Indian government engineered what they call the Naga People's Convention and so on to bring the Naga into the Indian state fold. You know? So therefore Naga, for example, realized at that time that this is not the right strategy, and we cannot just come out in the open as a community and fight the mighty military might. And therefore, the Naga leaders adopted after that switch to, for example, the guerrilla warfare, in order to survive. And then the Naga movement did much better. Because guerrilla warfare, of course, is using arm, but also is about political education when we are dealing both with the state and also within. That's how the Naga movement has survived. They were able to find the means to survive and have gone up and down a little bit, but far more stable. But what happened up to 1997? Then in the 90s, Nagas began to reach out to the international community by the armed resistance group itself. And they made many friends. They made international appeal and also won a lot of support from international community. And there were very committed organizations and individuals who were really willing to support the Naga peace process. And that is the only reason why Nagas were able to hold the Naga peace talks in the third neutral country. I believe this was unimaginable for the Indian prime ministers and Indian political leaders, but Nagas managed that, and there is a reason for that. So the issue of this guerrilla warfare also moved on to this kind of a more political approach, enlarging in terms of enlarging its scope and reaching out also to the international community. And of course, Naga civil society were also more and more reaching out to the Indian civil society. So support were beginning to come from different areas. But then what happened in 1997 after the ceasefire was signed? Eventually, we began to see the drawbacks, or sliding back of the strength of the Naga movement, because we had only relied on our influence that we had in the pre-1997. We have not continued, and our strategy was not encompassing and failed to actually continue the enlargement of the political scope that we had generated in the 90s before the signing of the ceasefire agreement. And therefore, the ceasefire agreement and the negotiation has been so much now reduced to the domestic level, and we see that this is not doing good for us. We're at the losing end. The scope is diminishing. This is the thing. So similarly, when I'm talking about enlarging ourselves, means that Naga leadership must look at the advantage that we're able to have. And we would have been able to have that advantage much more if we're able to harness the human resources that we have today. But if there is no scope for participation and no scope to contribute in a streamlined way, I'm not saying in a chaotic way, of the potentials that we have as Naga community, so many individuals are there, our range have really increased, but these are all bubbling and dancing and jumping in frustration, anger, bitterness, etc. So it is contributing to the chaoticness instead of strengthening the movement, because we are not able to harness this. So therefore, it is how do we harness this in order to increase the discourse and deliberation within ourselves about who we are and how we want to organize ourselves, and the reach and influence that we want to generate outside of the Naga people itself, including the neighbors. That should have to be the kind of conception and openness and vastness of the kind of vision that we want to think about and talk about. That is the way, to me, I believe, can strengthen the Naga movement. And it is not the end. At this point of time, it may look like the collapse of our political time, but I don't think that should be the case, and it is not the case. A lot will still depend on us, and how do we come together and concretize the kind of processes that we want to see. Yes, thank you.
Yeah, I have two last questions. But before that, let me just read out a small, it's rather a comment. As Sir Shimray mentioned, achieving collective selfhood in partnership with India are important. The universal human rights should be read to frame the new constitution, or else our future is bleak. That is a comment. Now, moving to next question. This is the second last question. After that, we have one more question, okay? What could possibly be a good approach to make the younger generation of Nagas more aware of their rights in relation to self-determination without being distracted or lured by political and social media gimmicks?
Yeah, okay. This question, I think, is partly related to the earlier one, so I may be repeating a little bit here. But I think the comment made, though, just a slight comment, further comment to that, that is, I think, very important. So that's why at the very start of the principles of the ceasefire agreement and of the talks, if you remember, is highest level, third neutral country, and unconditional. No? I was reading this concept of the point of unconditional being that universal yardstick. Because Indian Constitution should not insist, because we know how to read the minds of the Indian political leaders, because we have been reading the Indian Constitution. And we know what will come in as an insistence to the Nagas. No? For me, I know that to some extent. It was clear to me. And we see that there are problems there, and it cannot be accommodated. Similarly, Nagas were demanding independence at the initial stages. That could become also the conditionality. But then what is the way out is this aspect of unconditionality, and we should have pitched on the international standards and the knowledge and how things are resolved, that kind of already established information that already exists in the international arena, and that should have been the basis from the very start, and we should have pitched that. Therefore, I believe we would have made more progress if that was the case, no? But there is no harm in still exploring and trying to insist and find ways to that. Now, to this question of this internet, I think it is quite destructive, and many researchers are showing how it is destructive. And actually, it will also show how it is impacting on boys differently, and also on girls differently, and so on. And this overwhelming of this information through the social media, which we are not able to process, no? Because we think that we know everything. We just Google search some information and it comes out. So the question is, do we really know, or do we just Google know, for example, no? That is becoming the question. So children will not ask the parents anymore, because you want to know some facts, you come out to the Google. So what is expected from the parents is no more that kind of facts that we give to the children. It is shifted. But the children will not realize that what is the guardianship that the elders are supposed to provide, and that there is something in that guardianship that our elders had provided, and still as parents and so on can still provide. Now, those things are what is going out of the window today, and that is part of the chaotic scenario that has been, that has kind of permeated into our younger generation, no? But there is also the positive sign, and I think we must try to see where these positive trends are and where do we pitch ourselves. So for example, you know, in my office, I am required to make many communications. And my communication person will always insist that your message should not be more than 2 minutes. And then later on, my communication person started saying that your message should not be more than 1 minute, because the attention span of the people is that. Otherwise, you will not be able to communicate. But what do I communicate in 1 minute? But the positive trend that we see today is that a lot of hunger for deeper discussion is coming about today in the Western world and Europe and so on. No, so I see that there are now podcasts in the internet that is even a duration of 3 hours, minimum 1.5 hours, and so on. And there are millions and millions of people beginning to watch. And why this is so is also because there is this new hunger generated from the kind of vacuum and emptiness that one also is beginning to feel in terms of the in-depth knowledge that really help us as human beings in our life. Because we are destroying ourselves, and already this new generation that is internet savvy have destroyed themselves. And this a lot of people are beginning to already see. So there is also this movement in this trend. You know? So the question would be that we have to see how we can generate that hunger for that kind of information and discussion that really takes up to the depth. And it cannot be just an intellectual discourse. We have to see how to engage ordinary people in those things. So again, I would go back to this issue of our awareness about the need and necessity, you know, then I think we can find the best way to go about this. I think the discussion forums are very good, important. For example, I think this webinar is also a learning process for me from the comments and the questions that you're putting on me, for example, no?
Okay, here is the last question for today. In the context of diversity that exists in the Naga community itself, would the idea of a constitution be not a reiteration if the colonial notion of a nation state as we have it today? How do you conceive the idea of a Naga constitution to be? That's the last question.
Okay. The last one, but I think a big question. So I'm not sure how precise I can be here, but let me just give it a try. I think, I don't know if this question is reflective of what the Indian Constitution is trying to do in terms of trying to capture the diversity. Otherwise, I would see that in the colonial period, most of it would emphasize, of course, diversity, but it's more towards uniformity, you know, how to create uniformity. So it is not really in terms of cherishing and giving space to the diversity. Because we know that it is politically challenging, easy to say unity and diversity and so on, but it is politically challenging in terms of how this diversity can actually flourish and how these diverse people can come together. Because the level of challenge of forming this collective selfhood is even more challenging when we talk about people who have no relationship in terms of culture and the worldview, for example. No? The distance that we, for example, we see between India and Naga is that the mainstream culture is so distant to us, and mainstream culture was never introduced in a good way to the Nagas anyway, because when we came to know of the Naga was only through fighting. And neither does India knows anything about Nagas. It's all about Nagas being subhuman beings, savages, eating this and that. Recently you have heard about this dog meat ban and controversy about all those, for instance. That is the image. So you look at, when I was in Delhi, for instance, when it comes to tourism, the government, the tourism department was describing the Northeast people and the Naga as that the people should discover the wonders of Northeast, the undiscovered paradise, with that kind of hospitality and the most humble, noble, and you know, well-mannered people and so on. Right? what tourism department will do. On the other side, the Home Ministry and others will say, this is the region addicted to drug addiction, HIV, you know, all these kind of things, and terrorism and so on. You contrast this kind of image. So when the colonial constitution or this kind of is talking about unity and diversity, it has no interest and actual deep commitment to how to promote that kind of diversity. And that's also the reason why I was saying how Modi government is trying to homogenize this heavy diversity that we see in India. India essentially ended up drafting a constitution that is the longest in the world, more than 300 articles, to try to capture this kind of diversity, you know. But in today's world, when we are talking about legal pluralism, for example, some we talk about legal pluralism, whether it's even in Canada or in Latin America, the conviction and understanding is very different. You know, it is very much outside the box of this colonial structure. But India is facing this contradiction because it has a lot of this colonial structure. You know? So if we are looking at diversity within ourselves, just to help for the sake of elaboration for better understanding, is that the reason that we're insisting, for me at least, insisting on the Naga constitution is that in the Indian constitution, flourishing of the diversity is not possible, especially at the level of the uniqueness of the culture that we have, and is so far and distant from the mainstream Indian society, you know. But it does not stop us from having partnership, for instance, if the vision is clear. So this cultural distance is real. And you know, when the memorandum of the Simon Commission was submitted, our elders talked about the difficulty in associating, being subsumed within the Indian state, is because they were very clear in a very crude way that the Indian hate us and we are untouchables because we eat beef. And the Muslim will hate us because we eat pork, for example. No? It speaks a lot. It is in a crude form, but the cultural distance, you know, in the way that we associate ourselves is so different. And of course, we can go a lot into that. So how do we, therefore, is the talk about this pluralism, diversity, has to essentially look at political pluralism. And there are now these, not just the Nagas have hardly started talking about it, but these are things already being in discussion in Latin America and even in Canada, because they are reframing in terms of how are they going to accommodate self-government of indigenous peoples. And necessarily, if they also have to celebrate diversity, then there has to be that kind of political autonomous space that allows you to design your own institutions and government that will nurture that diversity of your identity and of the selfhood that we are talking about now. I think that is the way to go about. I know this is a big question, so it's hard for me to put in a precise way, so I apologize. It could be a one topic in itself.
Thank you, Gam. I still have some questions, but I must say I'm so sorry. I must apologize to our participants because I have some direction from the organizer to wind up the program. But yes, we have a very fruitful deliberations. I must thank Mr. Gam for your insightful talk. And in fact, we have gone much deeper beyond the topic of human rights and self-determination. And I also want to thank all the participants for your very active participation and contributions. certainly your contribution have made this discussion very enlightening. What I see is, going back to our culture, in talking about self-determination, I see a lot of energy in itself. Our culture that we have in hand has a lot of energy to contribute talking about self-determination, which perhaps we are yet to use or realize all this. I think it is important that through such discourses we realize many good things, the strength that we have, which we can make use of it for determining our future. Now, self-determination, to my understanding, is all about the ability to make choice, the ability to manage our future in the way it best suits our situation. So I think looking at all these issues from theoretical as well as from other traditional point of view, it is how we take it, the energy that we have, how we make use of it as per the situation. And I think it is definitely very enriching. And let me just thank our Naga Scholars Association for organizing such a wonderful meeting. And thanks to GAM once again, and I must thank all the participants. And now I hand over the time to the organizer.
Well, thank you so much, Mr.Gam Shimray, for giving such a comprehensive presentation. And today we are also fortunate to have a very generous chairperson, Professor Lanusashi. He has given so much time to all the participants to answer the queries which they have. Yeah, so in spite of going on for nearly 2 hours, I think we did not see anybody going away, leaving from the discussion. Thank you very much for for chairing the session so effectively. Now we give the time to our General Secretary of Naga Scholars Association, Dr. Lu, to give the vote of thanks. Please unmute your mic.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much. On behalf of the Naga Scholars Associations, we would like to thank all the participants this evening. Especially, we would like to thank our speaker, Mr.Gam Shimray. He's from Ching Mai. He's based in Ching Mai. He's the director of the AIPP. And thank you for the time. And also thank you, our chairperson, Professor Lanu from Nagaland University, for spending your precious time for being with us with this NSA. And also we would like to thank the reporters, Yanthan from the Nagaland University itself, and also our flyer designer, Russell Hamso. And today we have an audience from all over the world. I would like to thank especially Professor Murari Suvidi. He is a professor from Michigan State University. He was once here in an essay talk. We would like to thank you so much, sir, for being with us this evening. And also all the participants from various parts of the world and the globe to be with us through this digital platform. And many of us are also participating through this Zoom as well as the Facebook. And many more events of this NSA are coming up. So please do keep in touch, and we will update in our NSA Facebook and as well as NSA WhatsApp group as well. And again, I would like to thank, again, from the Naga Scholars Association, I'd like to thank everyone, the participants and all the speakers for this beautiful special event of the NSA. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Technical support team?
Yeah, the support team of the digital, the technical support, the EDU trainers, yes, for giving us all the their support for able to do this Zoom. meeting and this Facebook Live. Thank you so much from the NSA. Yes. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, everyone,
we have
for
one of
joining
the
us.
largest viewers, 150 plus, I guess. So thank you, all the participants. Yeah, yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Yeah. Yeah, thank you so much to the technical support team, Mr. Hashim from Aligarh Muslim University, and Jesse Rashid, Rizwan from Edu Trainers, who is an NGO which focuses on providing education to disadvantaged people in society, like refugees, tribal slum dwellers, and all. We look forward to have even more, collaboration with Edu Trainers even in the days to come. Thank you very much, everyone, and goodbye for today.